Now, replying to the court application by 19 parties who filed an application, President Ramaphosa says it is not his mandate to provide electricity, as that falls in the municipal purview. Now, UDM leader General Bantu Holomisa, who is one of the parties in court applying for this, has responded that Ramaphosa is not correct in saying that it is the responsibility or function of municipalities, because municipalities are not responsible for the national regulation of load shedding. Now, joining us now are economic and energy analyst Tshepo Kgadima, and with him is German attorney and professor international emeritus of international law at Unisa, Professor André Thomashausen. Thanks so much to both of you, gentlemen, for joining us this morning.
Very good morning to you.
Good morning, listeners.
So let me start effectively by asking both of you the question, first and foremost, what your views are on these latest developments regarding the 19 parties court application against load shedding, and of course also President Ramaphosa's response to it in the immediate term. Professor Thomashausen, let me start with you.
Yes, good morning. I think the first important starting point is that in the midst of our many socio-economic rights in the Constitution, we do not guarantee a right to access to electricity. We have in Article 26 of the Constitution the right to housing, and some might argue that the right to housing, a house, is meaningless if you don't have electricity in the house. But this argument is a bit far-fetched, and it doesn't meet reality. So it is not as if people could go to court and say, I want lights in my house.
Mr. Kgadima, your response to this?
Look, I think the president has attempted to pass the proverbial buck down the road to somebody else and not taking responsibility. But from reading from his affidavit, it appears to me that there is actually a complete disregard for the national legislation, particularly two pieces of legislation which would, of course, vest power in cabinet. The one being the Electricity Regulation Amendment Act of 2007, as well as the Eskom Conversion Act of 2001. And more so, the Eskom Conversion Act actually places the duty and the responsibility in the Minister of Public Enterprises. So the minister is appointed by none other than the president, and therefore the attempt to say that even the cabinet minister responsible is reporting or is held accountable by Parliament and not by his office, it's, I think the argument in whole, I regard it to be legally bizarre and absurd. Because if you apply the Eskom Conversion Act, specifically Section 6, subsection 5, A and B of that legislation, you would find that indeed it is the duty and the obligation of the national government, and specifically the Department of Public Enterprises, to ensure that there is universal access of electricity in the least cost manner possible. So I would be surprised if the court can actually agree with the president's argument as contained in his affidavit.
Professor Thomashausen, if I could bring you in there, in response to what Mr. Kgadima is saying, because also you look at what has been said in argument against the president's response, and the Section 4 of the Municipal Systems Acts of 2000 actually provides that municipal councils have a duty to give members of a community equitable access to municipal services to which they are entitled. But the argument is, of course, that the municipalities can only provide the electricity that is provided to them by Eskom. So if Eskom is unable to provide that electricity, the municipalities cannot provide it, and therefore perhaps to agree, those who make that argument with Mr. Kgadima, the president and government ultimately are responsible. What's your take on that?
Well, the entire affidavit is quite mediocre. I have for 40 years studied court papers and submissions to court. This one is a particularly poor and bad one. And obviously it's disingenuous to pretend that municipalities are not part of the South African state, that maybe Kailicha is part of Botswana or that Soweto is part of Mozambique. This is silly. Obviously, they form part of the state, of the public sector. If they don't pay their bills, for instance, their electricity bills, then the province and ultimately the national government and their CEO, which is the president, is responsible for this failure. So Ramaphosa can't just turn away and say, I've got nothing to do with this. This is a problem of the municipalities. Of course, he is the CEO of the country, so he is responsible for these failings. And I think this is where, besides the legal arguments, one should begin to focus on, that is to understand that this was like a beautiful top-of-the-range BMW, and you allowed people on the street corner to start repairing or redoing its engine. And so now it's broken. So we have to understand that something has gone wrong, something has failed, and only once we accept that could we possibly find solutions.
So speaking of the legal arguments, as you say, they are mediocre at best, and also just looking at the responses, the president says, Professor Thomashausen, that he would be encroaching on the functions of the local sphere of government and their function. Does he have a point in that regard when he makes that argument, or is he just grasping at straws, so to speak?
It is not an argument, because the corporation, which is the state, is responsible for all its elements, for all its bits and pieces. And they can't just say, I can't interfere in the municipality. Of course he can interfere in the municipality. He can put them under administration if they fail in the execution of their duties. And they have to, like anybody corporate, the owners of the Mall of Africa cannot go and tell the customers, we have nothing to do with toilets that aren't functioning. Of course they have. It's their toilets, and they must look after them, and they must appoint people that are capable of cleaning them. So we can't allow this type of reasoning. And I think what is really happening here is an attempt to not take responsibility, to not admit that under his watch, and before he became president, he chaired the Eskom war room, which was responsible for trying to fix Eskom for years. He can't just walk away from this and say, oh no, it's the municipality's problem.
Tshepo, to come to you, if you'd like to weigh in on some of that, but also you say that Eskom is celebrating 100 years of existence, but this could be its burial. Exactly what do you mean by that? Why you think this could be the burial of Eskom? And, is it possible that this could be saved in any way, shape or form?
Well, we are at a precipice of the total collapse of the grid of the country. And I mean this very sincerely. So tomorrow, yes, Eskom is celebrating the centenary. But when you take into account what has the harm that has been exerted on Eskom as an entity and as an organ of statute, as I say, it is established, or rather it operates under the Eskom Conversion Act of 2001. And you look at the performance, particularly over the last 9 years, that this president, in his erstwhile position as the deputy president and leader of government business, and currently as the president, everything that he has sought to do in order to bring about stability has unfortunately led to even more dysfunctionality. We are seeing a Eskom that 8 years ago was able to meet demand of at least 34,000 megawatts. And today we have a Eskom that cannot even meet the reduced demand of electricity of 29,000 megawatts. And hence we are having rolling blackouts. But also the president, I think, by and large, has admitted in a different forum and more so in parliament Hence, he has even come up with he has contrived a position of the so-called Minister of Electricity, notwithstanding that the Eskom Conversion Act makes electricity generation, transmission, as well as in some parts distribution. It makes it the duty of Eskom, the primary business of Eskom is to do that, and that lies with the Minister of Public Enterprises. So everything that has been done by the president, the unlawful interference, instead of intervening using the relevant statutes, has led to this situation whereby now Eskom is no longer a going concern. Let's bear this in mind. At the end of this financial year, Eskom would have incurred revenue losses of at least 30%. So even if they had thought they would sell 193,000 gigawatt hours of electricity in the current financial year, we've had over 210 days of rolling blackouts. Therefore, the question is, how is that founded on that Eskom can continue to be a going concern? We are dealing here with a company that is, for all intents and purposes, insolvent. And I doubt that the new chair of Eskom will rise to the occasion tomorrow by being able to, I think, mobilize and galvanize the troops, meaning the 42,000 workers or so of Eskom, to really be able to do something else to save Eskom, increase the energy availability factor, and ensure that Eskom can go back to the glory days. So that failure means that we are closer to more the great collapsing, because once we drop below 20,000 megawatts of generating capacity from Eskom, you can imagine the catastrophe that will ensue thereof.
Professor Thomashausen, what Tshepo Kgadima is talking about goes to the heart of this particular application by the 19 parties who say that they want government to be ordered to table a plan within 7 days with steps that it would take to end load shedding. And among other things, there was, of course, some sort of request that certain sectors be basically spared the difficulty of undergoing load shedding. But the government and Eskom, through the outgoing, or now the former CEO, André Thomashausen, in his responding affidavit, he practically said that if they were to stop load shedding, if some of these sectors, for example, were to be exempt, it could in fact lead to the total collapse of the grid. So where does this leave us as a country?
Well, obviously courts cannot generate electricity, so courts cannot order the supply of energy that doesn't exist. So if the resource is very limited, we have to decide on priorities. Obviously, once the grid collapses, the priority will be to keep the pumps going, because the whole of Gauteng is very high. It's around 1,500 meters above sea level. So everything, fuel, diesel, gasoline, water, has to be pumped. And if that stops, then within 8 or 9 days, you will have 15 million people in total distress. So yes, at the end of the day, priorities in a total national emergency will have to be determined. And it will mean that households and all non-essential aspects of life will be without power. But before we get there, there are, of course, solutions. We're not alone on this planet. If we look at Russia, there are no blackouts, and the cost of electricity per kilowatt hour is about half of what it is in South Africa. Sweden has 0 blackouts. Even Philippines has 0 blackouts. So there are a number of countries that manage to provide energy, electricity, to everyone in the country at a very reasonable rate, half our cost. And maybe we should turn to those countries. Maybe we should say, look, we tried for 20 years to fix our situation, and we just don't have enough experienced engineers, and we don't have the knowledge. We give up on localization under the emergency regulations. And we, for instance, ask the Russian power utility to take over Eskom for 4 or 5 years and to fix it and to run it. And this way we can avoid what the writer calls a total national catastrophe, and which Tshepo just now also illustrated what could happen. some emergency measures need to be taken, because on the slippery slope that we're on now, I don't think we will succeed.
So I'm going to ask both of you gentlemen, and of course, if you are able to, please stay with us. I just want to put the discussion on pause for just a short while as we go to our news at 8. But if you aren't able to stay with us, you could just tell our producers off air, and we'll see how to take it forward with whoever is available. Professor André Thomashausen, as well as Mr. Tshepo Kgadima, talking to us there about whether President Cyril Ramaphosa has an obligation as, of course, the president of the country through government to actually supply electricity to the country, as the president opposes that application that seeks the court to order government to reduce or stop load shedding. We'll continue with that in a short while. Right now, we return to our conversation, and this regarding our question of the day as well, the context that we promised to bring to that question, where President Cyril Ramaphosa basically has given a response in regard to the court challenge that seeks to order government to stop load shedding. Now, in replying to the court application by 19 parties who filed an application, Ramaphosa says that it is not his mandate to provide electricity, as that falls in the purview of municipalities. But UDM leader General Bantu Holomisa, who is one of the parties in that court application, has responded, saying that Ramaphosa is not correct in saying that, and because municipalities are not responsible for national regulation of load shedding. And we've been in conversation with energy analyst Tshepo Kgadima and German attorney and professor international emeritus of international law at Unisa, Professor André Thomashausen. And gentlemen, thank you so much to both of you for your time. A very important discussion. As you heard in our news, most of the stories relate in one way or another to electricity provision, either what's going on at a national level or what's going on at local government and grassroots level, where, as we heard in the Danville story in the Northwest Province, people are angry. They're blockading roads because they've been without electricity for 4 days, and the municipality says there's nothing we can do about it. And I think this comes to the heart of this particular court challenge and also the president's response. But Tshepo Kgadima, let me ask you this. You know, one of the things that I've been looking through and what people have been saying is that why did the president not come out and say this in a more public way? Why are we learning about this stance from the president and government through court papers?
Well, it can be arguably said that the president speaks with a forked tongue, because what he said in Parliament and what he says whenever he speaks to the people of South Africa, yes, indeed, is diametrically opposed to what he has now stated under oath in this affidavit. But here is the nub of the issue. Electricity is fundamental to the upholding and the promotion of the Bill of Rights. In fact, the Bill of Rights, at least 13 sections of the Constitution in the Bill of Rights are impeded, violated, affected adversely whenever there is no electricity. But also, a total collapse of the grid is such a serious risk that is facing this nation, to the extent that it can never be acceptable that a president can simply argue in the manner that Cyril Ramaphosa, as president, has argued, to the effect that, well, even if, well, he has discharged his duty by appointing ministers in the form of Minister of Public Enterprise as well as the Minister of Energy, and that therefore any effort on his part must be seen as a rather best effort basis, and if the best efforts does not yield the necessary results, he should not be held any more accountable than that, because that is at the heart, that his failure, his so-called best efforts not being able to produce the desired effects that are or outcomes that are effective, that can resolve the problem, unfortunately brings in this much more bigger risk, whereby he can be said to himself be guilty of having violated his oath of office, which I understand to be the case that is advanced and the argument that is advanced by the UDM and, of course, the 17 others. So, but electricity is fundamental to the Bill of Rights, and I think it is important for the president to at least understand that, but act in a manner that is lawful. The introduction of the so-called National Electricity Crisis Committee as an intervention, which is actually the old war room reincarnated, is itself an unlawful intervention, and if anything, has only sought to exacerbate an already dire situation. And the president needs to understand that. What he needs to do is to hold the ministers responsible, totally accountable, because at this juncture, those ministers, according to him, he argues that, well, Parliament must do something else in terms of inquiring on their competence or lack thereof, and to determine what sanction Parliament is to make before a court can even have jurisdiction on the matter. It's, as I say, it is legally bizarre and upset an argument that he has advanced, but the country is in the precipice of a major catastrophe, and hence the president needs to act within at least the 7 days that I think the applicants in this matter have sought.
Indeed, they have. As we wrap this up, Professor Thomashausen, you touched on this briefly in an earlier response, but President Ramaphosa says that the Constitution does not actually prescribe the consequences of what he does when he exercises his executive authority in working with other members of cabinet, and therefore the courts also thereby cannot prescribe those consequences. Do you agree with that?
Well, the president in South Africa under our constitution is the chief executive. So the buck stops at the president's door, and he cannot just reverse and say, no, I'm just a master of ceremonies. I anoint people, I select people, anoint them, and if they don't function, it's not my problem. This is not true. This is not in the spirit of cooperative government. The outputs matter. We're not in school. This is like a 14-year-old saying, I failed my exam, but I'm not to blame for it because in the morning I tied my shoelaces and I blew my nose and I had my writing instrument ready. I don't know why I failed. This is not an acceptable government, and it's not an acceptable solution. I think we have to, for an urgent remedy, again, look at other places in the world where there are no blackouts. The turbines are always the same. The science of producing electricity, the engineering is the same. If it doesn't work in South Africa, we must turn to the countries where it works and ask them to help us to take over an emergency management, at least of some of the power stations, for instance, and we will very quickly see results. And these are close friends of South Africa. Sweden is a close ally. So is Russia, so is China. They do not have blackouts. Iran doesn't have blackouts. And they have actually the lowest cost energy in the world per capita. So the local content was prescribed with the best of intentions. But after 20 years, we should accept that locally we do not have sufficiently experienced and qualified capacities to fix the Eskom problem. We need help.
And of course, you are not the courts, but in 30 seconds or less, if both of you could just quickly give me your perspective and how you think this court case is ultimately going to play out. Mr. Kgadima and then Professor Thomashausen. Mr. Kgadima?
Look, I'm not sure that the court will come to the aid or grant the relief that has been sought, but that is for another day. But Eskom can actually bring to an end once and for all rolling blackouts within 90 days. They must appoint the right minister. They must appoint the right people. And right now, that is a problem that we have as a nation, that they've got the wrong people in place. But they do have all the resources to bring an end to load shedding and cut down the unnecessary, fruitless and wasteful expenditure that has plagued that entity into bankruptcy.
Professor?
As I said before, the courts cannot produce electricity. They do not generate it. They can interfere if the usage of the available energy is evidently inequitable or irrational, and if essential services like hospitals, water pumping, safety and security are affected by blackout measures that are just blanket, that do not discriminate between the relevance of certain services and certain and upkeeps. So there the court might direct Eskom that yes, they cannot switch off hospitals, and if the grid system doesn't allow to selectively keep certain parts under power, then they will just have to adapt that. But most of us know there are streets in Pretoria, in Johannesburg and in Cape Town that never experience any load shedding because a minister happens to live there. So it is possible to exempt certain streets, certain users from the usage of energy.
Well, thanks so much, gentlemen, for your time this morning. Those were Professor André Thomashausen, Professor International Emeritus of International Law at Unisa, and economic and energy analyst Tshepo Kgadima on whether President Cyril Ramaphosa has an obligation to supply electricity to the country, as Ramaphosa opposes the application that seeks the court to order government to reduce or stop load shedding.